Hey everyone, welcome to Daily Revelations. Thanks for joining me and continuing to just unpack what God has to show us each day and then applying it to our lives and moving on from where we are to where He's taking us. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. This is in Genesis 28 is where I want to kind of settle and talk about what I read there this morning. And just how it intersects with a book that I've been reading. It's called Possible, and it's by the founder of World Relief. And he talks about just the possibility that God has built in everyone that follows him to save the world. But the fact that many don't listen to what he has laid on their lives as their calling, and or just dismiss it and say, well, that's just not for me. And our story about Jacob in this chapter really brought back again to me this theme that God continues to use throughout the entire Bible, through all of his people, and continues to do it today as we see how people have been called to do simple things, big things, but all their stories have a very similar beginning. And yet it is the choice of the individual on where it goes after that. That God lays on all of our hearts a calling, but can we press through until we hit breakthrough and then be in a place where we have been pruned enough to be useful for his work. And that's what it takes. And unfortunately, we live in a society where things are supposed to be easy and things are supposed to come to you. And when they don't, then we think, well, then that just wasn't for me. And maybe I heard wrong from God and I'm just going to settle in right here. Well, unfortunately, that's how I was going to let my story play out too, until God really got a hold of me and said, remember what I told you a long time ago? This is going to happen and you need to keep moving on. So I'm going to go to that story in just a little while, but I want to share what happens with Jacob. So Jacob, he tricked his father into giving him his blessing, and then in the whole thing as it plays out, and these are the previous chapters, his older brother that he stole the blessing from was about ready to kill him, so his mom said, you need to get out of here. And so Jacob's on his journey to go back to his mom's homeland to find a wife, and God has a very divine time that he meets up with Jacob and shows him a vision and how the covenant that he promised his grandfather Abraham was something he was going to continue on with him. Well, Jacob had no relationship with God. He had not even really encountered God. He had heard about God. But here is God telling him, this is what I have for you and for your descendants in the future. And you know what Jacob says after this whole vision is, well, if you bring me back to this place, then I'll consider following you. And he leaves it at that and goes off. He doesn't realize that God's going to take him through hell and back before he gets back to that point, that it's going to be 15 plus years before he turns around and is able to come back to that land with then 2 wives instead of 1 because his father-in-law tricks him. But that's all to come yet. Anyways, but this theme of God giving a vision and then taking that person who's been given that vision into a time of descent. And this is what this book Possible says. It says, a glimpse followed by a descent, followed by a breakthrough. If you look, you'll see this pattern everywhere. And he talks about David and how David as a young boy was, basically Samuel said, you will be king. But here, what all these crazy things that happened in David's life between there and there. And yet he held on to that vision and didn't take it into his own hands to receive it himself. He allowed God to play it out the way God wanted to play it out. Joseph, the same story. he had these visions of how his brothers would bow down to him. And here he ended up in, being sold as a slave in prison and yet then exalted. And Paul, if you don't know the whole story of Paul, I mean, we understand that he had been killing Christians and then he got knocked down. Do you know there was about a 13-year span after that happened that Paul was not in any ministry at all? God took him to the depths to teach him and to really help him to understand what it was that he needed to prune out of his life in order to be of good service. And so that takes me to my story. So when I first started homeschooling, I had walked out of ministry working with MOPS International and homeschooled for a while and found that God was laying a vision on my heart to help parents who homeschool children with special needs. My kids were 7 and 5. And not until a year and a half ago did that dream become a reality through the nonprofit that I started. Between there and when God gave me that vision, He's taken me to some really big depths in my life. He's taken me out of some pretty big depths in my life. He's removed the depression in my life, the parenting anger that I was dealing with. He brought me to a farm where he pruned a whole lot off my character. I was a foster parent for over a year to some kids that had extreme issues. Just what God brought me through. And then even, when I don't know, I haven't shared a lot of this story. When we moved to Texas, I told God I was done with that vision. I was ready to follow my blog that I was writing about recipes and making cheese, and I was just going to settle down at a dairy and be their cheesemaker and be content with that. And yet I was confronted by that vision as a woman sat next to me and said, "Your experience is needed. You need to keep pressing on." And that's when I started back into working with parents who had kids with special needs and homeschooling. And, God still had a lot to prune off of me during that process. When I worked with the Texas Homeschool Coalition, he took us through some pretty nasty church issues that pruned some more off of my character. But in the end, pressing through is what got me to the point where I'm at now. And it's not a fun process. I will admit it. But yet, would I have been as effective with receiving that calling as I am now if I hadn't been through that descent? No. And I wouldn't want to change any of it either, no matter how painful it was. Because I know that I'm where I need to be right now, and I continue learning. I'm not perfect, far from it. But yet, I see the issues that could have happened had I not been in the place that God needed me to be before He really got the ball rolling on what my calling was, even though He showed it to me a long time ago. And this is the point. God can give you a vision. And when it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that it was a mistake. It doesn't mean that you heard wrong. It just means that He's preparing you and you need to hold on. You need to hold on like I did, like David did, like Joseph did, like Paul did, and so many others. I mean, he uses examples of people in modern day life. Nelson Mandela, Abraham Lincoln, Mother Teresa. All of these people went through that same thing, but they pressed through. They did not allow the descent to overtake them or to take away that vision that they kept on remembering. So So I just encourage you as you look into what has God said to me? Have I forgotten it? Or am I pressing through? Am I pressing through to see that God will change me so I am ready for the vision that He has for me to fulfill? And He does. For every one of us, there is a calling. And it may not be a super big, crazy calling, but it's a calling. And it's an important calling because it will affect the people around you. And it is part of God's story. And He wants you to be part of that. So thanks for joining me on Daily Revelations today, everybody. I'm sorry it was a little bit of a long one, but some days it is. And so just never know what tomorrow will bring. So just join me again on Daily Revelations. And